Patagonian giants, like others, captured the European imagination for a very long time. The first mention of this race surfaced in the 1520s from the account of Antonio Pigafetta, the chronicler of Ferdinand Magellan's expedition. But one day, without anyone expecting it, we saw a giant who was on the shore, near today's Puerto San Julian, Argentina, quite naked, and who danced, leaped, and sang. And while he sang, he threw sand and dust on his head. Our Captain Magellan sent one of his men toward him, charging him to leap and sing like the other, in order to reassure him and to show him friendship, which he did. Immediately the man of the ship, dancing, led this giant to a small island where the captain awaited him. And when he was before us, he began to marvel and to be afraid, and he raised one finger upward, believing that we came from heaven, and he was so tall that the tallest of us only came up to his waist. Withal he was well proportioned. The captain named the people of this sort Pathagoni. The etymology of the word is unclear, but Patagonia came to mean land of the Bigfoot. Magellan seized 2 of the younger males as hostages to bring back to Spain, but they got sick and died on the journey. Unbelievable. He stole 2 people to bring back, 2 giants, but they died. 100 years later, in The World Encompassed, London, 1628, the first detailed account of Sir Francis Drake's circumnavigation, the author, Drake's nephew of the same name, wrote, Magellan was not altogether deceived in naming them giants, for they generally differ from the common sort of men, both in stature, bigness, and strength of body, as also in the hideousness of their voice. Yet they are nothing so monstrous or giant-like as they were reported, there being some Englishmen as tall as the highest of any that we could see, but peradventure the Spaniards did not think that ever any Englishman would come thither to reprove them, and thereupon might presume the more boldly to lie. The name Pentagones 5 cubits, viz. 7 foot and a half, describing the full height, if not somewhat more, of the highest of them. But this is certain, that the Spanish cruelties there used, referring to Magellan's hostage-taking, had made them more monstrous in mind and manners than they are in body, and more inhospitable to deal with any strangers that shall come thereafter. He reduced the height of the Patagonians from 10 feet to 7.5 feet, but was obviously more intent on discrediting the Spanish and blaming them for the monstrosity of the giants. Ironically, though, he was really confirming the basic facts. English sailor offering bread to a Patagonian woman giant. It's the front piece to the first Italian edition of John Byron's A Voyage Around the World in His Majesty's Ship the Dolphin, Florence, 1768. In the 1700s, the myth was still alive and entertaining Europeans. Horace Walpole, the English historian and Gothic novelist, published an account of the giants lately discovered in a letter to a friend in the country, following the return in 1766 of Captain John Byron, who had circumnavigated the world in the HMS Dolphin. Word leaked that the crew had seen 9-foot giants in South America. Byron's May docking and Walpole's July publication suggest the rapidity with which rumors passed along the London grapevine. In his 31-page pamphlet, Walpole satirizes the whole idea and facetiously suggests that a limited number of the giant women could be imported for the sake of mending our breed. The official account of Byron's voyage, appearing in 1773, finally debunks it, but not without respecting the Patagonians' vertical features. So here's Byron's account. When we came within a little distance from the shore, we saw, as near as I can guess, about 500 people, some on foot, but the greater part on horseback. One of them, who afterwards appeared to be a chief, came towards me. He was of a gigantic stature, and seemed to realize the tales of monsters in a human shape. If I may judge of his height by the proportion of his stature to my own, it could not be much less than 7 feet. Mr. Cumming, one of Byron's officers, came up with the tobacco, a gift, and I could not but smile at his astonishment, which I saw expressed in his countenance, upon perceiving himself. though 6 feet 2 inches high, become a pygmy among giants. For these people may indeed more properly be called giants than tall men, the shortest of whom were at least 4 inches taller. So in this portion, I'll be reading to you directly from an account of the voyages undertaken by the order of His Present Majesty for making discoveries in the Southern Hemisphere, and successively performed by Commodore Byron, Captain Wallace, Captain Carteret, and Captain Cook, in the Dolphin, the Swallow, and the Endeavour, drawn up from the journals which were kept by these commanders and from the papers of Joseph Banks, Esquire. Voyages round the world. So I'm reading to you directly now from a general introduction. This cannot be done in an unbroken series when the complicated and multifarious objects of history are to be recorded. But as each of the narratives in this work is a single thread, the transactions of every day are set down in a regular succession and the time noted in the margin. Great care has been taken to make the charts and the nautical parts of the narrative coincide. If there should be any difference, which it is hoped will not be the case, the charts are to be confided in as of unquestionable authority. By the charts as well as by the narrative, especially by that on which the tracks of the several vessels are marked, it will be seen how far the existence or non-existence of a southern continent is already ascertained, and what land has in the course of these voyages been first discovered. The charts also will at one view present any mistake which might arise from the same name having been given to different islands by the several commanders in these voyages, without the trouble of comparing the latitudes and longitudes assigned them in the narrative. As it is but a very few years since the existence of a race of men above the common stature upon the coast of Patagonia was the subject of eager dispute among all ranks of people in this country, I have brought together the whole of the evidence on the question, as I find it in a collection of voyages lately printed in France, under the title of Histoire des Navigations aux Terres Australes. It must be acknowledged that the contrariety of the reports that have been made by ocular witnesses concerning a fact easy to be determined does not deviate less from the common course of things than the gigantic stature of the people in question. It appears that during 100 years, almost all navigators of whatever country agree in affirming the existence of a race of giants upon the coast of Patagonia, and that during another century, the much greater number agree in denying this fact, treating their predecessors as idle fabulists, and imputing their reports either to the terror which the rude fierceness of a savage people inspired, or to the natural propensity of mankind to assume importance by pretending to have seen wonderful things. That men have a strange propensity to the marvelous cannot be denied, nor that fear naturally magnifies its object. But though it be allowed that the accounts of the Patagonians have in some instances been exaggerated, it is certain that all who have affirmed their stature to be gigantic were not under the influence of fear, and it is very strange that nations who have an hereditary hatred to each other and an acknowledged opposition of interest should agree in asserting an evident falsehood. In the first place, it is well known to have been an opinion long established, both in our ancient world and in America, that there was once a race of giants upon earth who distinguished themselves by violence and guilt. Barbonet was told by the inhabitants of South America that a deluge having laid Peru under water, the Indians retired to the mountains till the flood should subside, and that when they came again down to the plain, they found there men of an enormous stature, who attacked them with great ferocity, killing many, and driving the rest to the caves of the rocks. But that having continued in their hiding places many years, they saw in the air a young man who destroyed the giants by thunderbolts, and thus restored to them the possession of their country. His guides also showed him many marks upon a rock, which they said were impressed by the thunderbolts, and many bones of an extraordinary size, which they believed to be remains of the giants. but they did not pretend to know when the deluge happened. The Inca Garcilaso de la Vega, in his History of Peru, Pedro de Sieca, Chapter 52, Garcilaso, History of Peru, Book 9, Chapter 9, relates that according to a tradition universally received, a number of vessels or junks came to Point St. Helena with a company of giants on board, of a stature so enormous that the natives of the country were not higher than their knees, that their eyes were as broad as the bottom of a plate, and their limbs proportionably large, that some of them were naked, and others slightly covered with the skins of beasts, that when they came on shore they dug a pit of an astonishing depth in the rock, and each of them consuming as much provisions as would be sufficient for 50 men, the country was soon exhausted, and they were obliged to live upon fish, that they seized the women of the country, to whom their brutality was fatal, and afterwards giving themselves up to worse vices, the whole race was destroyed by fire from heaven, which, however, left their bones unconsumed, as a lasting memorial of divine vengeance. Bones of an amazing size are said to have been found in this country, and fragments of teeth, which, if they were whole, must have weighed half a pound. Those who wish to know all the particulars of these American traditions may satisfy their curiosity by reading Torquemada, Book 1, Chapter 13 and 14, where they will find that these fables are very similar to those relative to the same subject in other parts of the world. The bones said to have been the bones of giants which have been found in America, and which were shown at Mexico and other places in the year 1550, are probably the bones of some animal unknown, and indeed nothing less than the sight of such a race of human beings, or of an entire skeleton, can be admitted as a proof of their existence. Turner, the naturalist, reports that in the year 1610 the thigh bone of a man was shown in London, who must have been of an enormous size. But this testimony is not decisive, though the author adds that he had himself seen near the River Plata, upon the coast of Brazil, a race of giants who went stark naked, and that the hinder part of their heads was flat and not round, that the women had long black hair, as coarse as a horse's mane, that the men were excellent archers, and besides their bow and arrows carried two massive balls or bullets, each fastened to one end of a thong, a weapon which they used with great dexterity and force, either by striking with it or throwing it like a stone from a sling. One of these giants, he says, was 12 feet high, but acknowledges that he saw no other so tall. Of this fact, there are other ocular witnesses who perhaps may be thought more worthy of credit. Among the Spaniards, Magellan, Loaiza, Sarmiento, and Nodal. Among the English, Cavendish, Hawkins, and Nivet. Among the Dutch, Sebald, De Noort, Lemaire, and Spilberg. And among the French, those who went on the expedition from Marseille and St. Malos. Those who bear testimony to the contrary are Winter, the Dutch Admiral Hermite, Froger in De Jean's narrative, and Sir John Narborough. Winter, after having himself seen the inhabitants of Patagonia, says in direct terms that the accounts of their being giants are falsehoods invented by the Spaniards, and it must be contested that the testimony of these navigators at least counterbalances the evidence on the other side, especially as they were best acquainted with the Strait of Magellan and the neighboring country. Such navigators as have visited this country and are silent with respect to the stature of the inhabitants, particularly Sir Francis Drake, must be considered as witnesses against the fact in question, for their silence is a proof that they saw nothing extraordinary. It must, however, be observed in the first place that the greater part of those who hold the affirmative in this question speak of people that inhabited the desert coast of Patagonia to the east and west, and that, on the contrary, those who hold the negative speak of those who inhabit the strait upon the sides of the utmost point of America to the north and south. The nations of these two districts are certainly not the same, and if the first have sometimes been seen in the strait, it cannot be thought strange, considering how short the distance is from Port St. Julian, which appears to be their ordinary habitation. Magellan and his people saw them there very often and trafficked with them, sometimes on board his ships and sometimes on shore. Nor was this all. He seized 2 of them and kept them prisoners in his vessel, one of whom was baptized some time before his death, and taught several words of his language to Pigafetta, who formed them into a little dictionary. These are facts than which nothing can be more positive or less subject to illusion. I affirm, says Nibbit, that when I was at Port Desire, I measured several dead bodies that I found buried there, which were from 14 to 16 spans high, and saw tracks in the sand which must have been left by people of nearly the same stature. I have also frequently seen at Brazil one of the Patagonians who had been taken at Port St. Julian, and though he was but a youth, he measured no less than 13 spans. And our English prisoners at Brazil have assured me that they had seen many men of the same stature upon the coast of the strait. Sebald de Weert says that when he was in the strait, he saw giants of the same bulk, who tore up trees by the roots that were a span in diameter with great facility. He also saw women that were gigantic, and others of the common stature. Oliver de Noort reports that he saw savages of a gigantic stature at Port Desire, but does not call them giants, that he took 6 of them prisoners and carried them on board his ship, one of whom afterwards told him that the country was inhabited by many different nations, 4 of which were of the ordinary stature, but that farther within the land, in a territory called Coin, there was a gigantic people distinguished by the name of Tyramenen, who were continually making war upon the other nations. Spielberg relates that he saw a man of an extraordinary stature upon the coast of Tierra del Fuego, but that the sepulchres which he found had received men of the common height. Eris Clatz, who is on board Lemaire's fleet in the character of commissary, a man well worthy of credit, declares that having visited the sepulchres which he discovered upon the coast of Patagonia, he found the bones of men who were between 10 and 11 feet high, which convinced him that the reports of former navigators were true. And here it must be confessed that the examination was made in cold blood, when it cannot be pretended that the object was magnified by fear. Some others, particularly Nodal and Sir Richard Hawkins, content themselves with saying that these savages were a head taller than the inhabitants of Europe, and of such a stature that the people on board their vessels called them giants. Such is the evidence of past times. We shall now consider that in the age in which we live. In 1704, the captains Harrington and Carman, who commanded 2 French vessels, one from St. Malo's and the other from Marseille, saw at one time 7 of these giants in Possession Bay. At another time 6, and at a third time they had an interview with a company of more than 400 men, part of whom were gigantic and part of the common stature. That Harrington and Carman reported this fact is attested by M. Frezier, superintendent of the fortifications of Britannia, a man well known and universally esteemed. Frezier never saw any of these savages himself, but he says that being upon the coast of Chile, Don Pedro Molina, governor of the Isle of Chiloé, and many other eyewitnesses told him that there was at a considerable distance within the country an Indian nation called by their neighbors Caquohes, who sometimes came down to the Spanish settlements that were more than 9 feet high, and were the same race with the Patagonians who lived on the eastern coast, and have been mentioned in former relations. We are told by Rovino de Lucen that the Spaniards who live upon the seacoast in South America report that certain white Indians inhabit part of Chile, with whom they are always at war, that they are of an enormous bulk and stature, and that whenever they take a Spanish prisoner, they force up the breastbone, as they would the shell of a tortoise, and tear out his heart. Narborough, on the contrary, though he agrees that the Indians who inhabit the mountains near the Spanish settlements at Chile and perpetually commit hostilities against them are tall, expressly denies that their stature is gigantic. He had often measured the skulls and the prints of the feet of the savages on the coast of the Strait of Magellan, which he says were of the common size. He had also several times seen numerous companies of them even at Port St. Julian, and these he declares not to be taller or bigger than other men. While Narborough is certainly a credible witness and his evidence is directly to the point, it is confirmed by that of Le Hermite, who says that the people he saw upon the coast of Terra del Fuego, though they were robust and well proportioned, were not larger than the inhabitants of Europe. And lastly, M. de Gen bears testimony that none of the people he saw at Port Famine were 6 feet high. Those who diligently consider these different relations will find reason to believe that all the parties have spoken truth, each of them faithfully reporting what he saw, and therefore that the existence of a gigantic race in these parts is a real fact, not to be questioned merely because they were not seen by every mariner that visited the country. It appears to be well established that the inhabitants of the two borders of the strait are of the common stature, and that the race distinguished by the name of Patagonians made their constant residence upon the desert coasts, either in some miserable hovels in the depth of the woods, or in some caverns of the rocks, scarcely accessible to any but themselves. And it appears from the account of Oliver de Noort that when the strait began to be frequented by European vessels, they hid themselves as soon as the ships were in sight, which accounts both for their not being seen and for the recent marks of inhabitants upon a coast that appeared to be deserted. Perhaps the frequent appearance of our ships upon this coast at length determined them to quit it as a settled habitation, returning only at particular seasons of the year, and taking up their constant residence in the interior part of the country. Lord Anson was of opinion that they resided statedly on the western side of the Cordillera Mountains, and visited the eastern side occasionally, but not often. So that if they have been rarely seen by the vessels which have touched at the coast of Patagonia for the last 100 years, the reason probably is, that being, like other Indian nations, desirous to conceal themselves from strangers, they retired to the mountains. It is indeed to be regretted that no skeleton of these people has been brought into Europe, and it may at first seem strange that no such evidence of their uncommon stature should have been produced, as it is known that several of them who had been made prisoners by the commanders of European vessels died on board soon after they came into a hot climate. But the wonder will cease when it is considered that all mariners have a superstitious opinion that the compass will not travel if there is a dead body on board the vessel. Upon the whole, it may reasonably be presumed that the concurrent testimony of late navigators, particularly Commodore Byron, Captain Wallis, and Captain Carteret, gentlemen of unquestionable veracity who are still living, and who not only saw and conversed with these people but measured them, will put an end to all the doubts that have been hitherto entertained of their existence. Having thus brought together the whole of the evidence for and against a fact which has long been the object both of popular and philosophical curiosity, I shall not anticipate any opinion that the reader may form concerning future navigations in the track which has been described by any of the vessels whose voyages are here related, except that although it is the opinion of Commodore Byron, who spent 7 weeks and 2 days in passing through the Strait of Magellan, that it may be passed in 3 weeks at the proper season, yet the passage cost Captain Wallis near 4 months, though he performed it precisely at the time recommended by the Commodore, having reached the eastern entrance about the middle of December. I cannot, however, dismiss my readers to the following narratives, without expressing the regret with which I have recorded the destruction of poor naked savages by our firearms in the course of these expeditions, when they endeavored to repress the invaders of their country, a regret which I am confident my readers will participate with me. This, however, appears to be an evil which, if discoveries of new countries are attempted, cannot be avoided. Resistance will always be made, and if those who resist are not overpowered, the attempt must be relinquished. It may perhaps be said that the expense of life upon these occasions is more than it is necessary to convince the natives that further contest is hopeless, and perhaps this may sometimes have been true. But it must be considered that if such expeditions are undertaken, the execution of them must be entrusted to persons not exempt from human frailty, to men who are liable to provocation by sudden injury, to unpremeditated violence, by sudden danger, to error by the defect of judgment or the strength of passion, and always disposed to transfer laws by which they are bound themselves to others who are not subject to their obligation, so that every excess thus produced is also an inevitable evil. If it should be said that supposing these mischiefs to be inevitable in attempting discoveries ought not to be attempted, it must be considered that upon the only principles on which this opinion can be supported, the risk of life for advantages of the same kind with those proposed in discovering new countries is in every other instance unlawful. If it is not lawful to put the life of an Indian in hazard by an attempt to examine the country in which he lives, with a view to increase commerce or knowledge, it is not lawful to risk the life of our own people in carrying on commerce with countries already known. If it be said that the risk of life in our own people is voluntary, and that the Indian is brought into danger without his consent, the consequence will still follow. For it is universally agreed, at least upon the principles of Christianity, that men have no more right over their own lives than over the lives of others, and suicide being deemed the worst species of murder, a man must be proportionably criminal in exposing his own life for any purpose that would not justify his exposing the life of another. If the gratification of artificial wants or the increase of knowledge are justifiable causes for the risk of life, the landing by force on a newly discovered country in order to examine its produce may be justified. If not, every trade and possession that exposes life for advantages of the same kind is unlawful. And by what trade or profession is not life exposed? Let us examine all the multitudes that art has employed, from the refiner who sweats at the furnace to the sedentary officer who grows pale at the loom. And perhaps none can be found in which life is not in some degree sacrificed to the artificial necessities of civil society. But will it therefore be said that civil society, to which this sacrifice is made, is for that reason a combination contrary to the great original principles of morality, which are the basis of all duty? Will it be said that to exercise the faculties which are the distinguishing characteristics of our nature is unnatural, and that being endowed with the various powers which in civil societies only can be brought into action, it was incongruous to the will of our Creator that any such society should be formed, and that it would be pleasing to Him if, still continuing in a savage state, these powers should lie torpid in our nature, like life in an embryo during the whole of our existence? This surely must appear extravagant and absurd in the highest degree, especially as it must be allowed that although commerce and arts in some instances expose life, in others they preserve it, they supply the wants of nature without rapine and violence, and by producing a common interest, they prevent the inhabitants of the same country from being divided into different clans, which among savages are almost perpetually committing hostilities against each other, with a ferocious cruelty which is not to be found where civil government and literary knowledge have ameliorated the manners of mankind. Upon the whole, therefore, it seems reasonable to conclude that the increase of knowledge and commerce are ultimately common benefits, and that the loss of life which happens in the attempt is among the partial evils which terminate in general good. I have now only to request of such of my readers as may be disposed to censure me for not having attributed any of the critical escapes from danger that I have recorded to the particular interposition of Providence, that they would, in this particular, allow me the right of private judgment, which I claim with the greater confidence, as the very same principle which would have determined them to have done it, has determined me to the contrary. As I firmly believe the divine precept delivered by the author of Christianity, there is not a sparrow falls to the ground without my Father, and cannot admit the agency of chance in the government of the world, I must necessarily refer every event to one cause, as well the danger as the escape, as well the sufferings as the enjoyments of life. And for this opinion I have, among other respectable authorities, that of the Bible. Shall we, says Job, receive good from the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil? The Supreme Being is equally wise and benevolent in the dispensation of both evil and good, as means of effecting ultimate purposes worthy of his ineffable perfections. So that whether we consider ourselves as Christians or philosophers, we must acknowledge that he deserves blessing, not more when he gives than when he takes away. If the fall of a sparrow, as well as its preservation, is imputed to providence, why not the fall as well as the preservation of a man? And why should we attribute providence only what appears to be good in its immediate effect, when we suppose that the whole concatenation of events, whether the preservation or destruction of particular parts, tends ultimately to the good of the whole? The same voice commissions the winds to plow up the deep, which at the appointed time rebukes them, saying, "Peace, be still." If the adorable author and preserver of nature was such a being as Baal is represented to have been by the prophet, when he derided his worshippers, if he was sometimes on a journey and sometimes asleep, we might with propriety say that a fire happened to break out, or a storm to rise, but that by the interposition of providence life was preserved. Expressions which imply that the mischief had one origin and the remedy another. But such language certainly derogates from the honor of the great universal cause, who, acting through all duration and subsisting in all space, fills immensity with his presence and eternity with his power. It will perhaps be said that in particular instances evil necessarily results from that constitution of things which is best upon the whole, and that the providence occasionally interferes and supplies the defects of the constitution in these particulars. But this notion will appear not to be supported by those facts which are laid to be providential. It will always be found that providence interposes too late, and only moderates the mischief which it might have prevented. But who can suppose an extraordinary interposition of providence to supply particular defects in the constitution of nature, who sees those defects supplied but in part? It is true that when the Endeavour was upon the rock of the coast of New Holland, the wind ceased, and that otherwise she must have been beaten to pieces. But either the subsiding of the wind was a mere natural event or not. If it was a natural event, providence is out of the question. At least we can with no more propriety say that providentially the wind ceased, than that providentially the sun rose in the morning. If it was not a mere natural event, but produced by an extraordinary interposition, correcting a deficit in the constitution of nature, tending to mischief, it will lie upon those who maintain the position to show why an extraordinary interposition did not take place rather to prevent the ship striking than to prevent her being beaten to pieces after she had struck. A very slight impulse upon the ship's course would have caused her to steer clear of the rock, and if all things were not equally easy to omnipotence, we should say that this might have been done with less difficulty than a calm could be produced by suspending the general laws of nature which had brought on the gale. I have, however, paid my homage to the Supreme Being, consonant to my own ideas of his agency and perfections, and those who are of opinion that my notions are erroneous must allow that he who does what he thinks to be right and abstains from what he thinks to be wrong acquits himself equally of moral obligation, whether his opinions are false or true. And that's the end of